The roar of the jet engines sliced through the summer night, scattering the murmurs of the glittering crowd below. Every face turned toward the runway as the sleek matte black Gulfstream G700 touched down, its landing lights slicing through the velvet darkness like a blade. It wasn't just any landing strip. This was the private tarmac of the Royal Horizon Hotel and Resort, a place where the wealthiest of the wealthy descended like gods from Olympus. Tonight, it had been rented exclusively for the Future Vision Gala, an event that was already humming with champagne-fueled gossip. And in the center of it all, at the foot of a red carpet leading from the runway, stood Nathaniel Cross. At 38, Nathaniel was a man who had clawed his way into New York's elite with a charm that could sell ice to an Eskimo, and a ruthlessness that could gut an empire. His sharp tuxedo gleamed under the floodlights. His arm rested lazily around the waist of a woman who looked like she'd been poured into her glittering silver gown. Sabrina Vale, his fiancée of exactly 3 months. They were the couple everyone was talking about. Not because of their whirlwind romance, but because of the woman who wasn't there. Nathaniel's ex-wife, Claire Lawson Cross, 6 months pregnant when he'd walked out, hadn't been seen in nearly a year. The breakup had been messy, whispered about in boardrooms and beauty salons alike. Officially, Nathaniel had fallen in love with Sabrina after a chance meeting at a charity gala. Unofficially, half the city knew Sabrina had been in the picture long before the divorce papers were signed. The crowd buzzed as Nathaniel tightened his hold on Sabrina's hip. "That jet belongs to a head of state or a tech mogul," she whispered, her lips curling into a knowing smirk. "Whoever it is, they're not here for you." Nathaniel smiled thinly. "They might be. I know everyone worth knowing." The Gulfstream rolled to a smooth stop. A ground crew in crisp uniforms rushed forward, laying out a thick scarlet runner from the jet stairs to the reception area. Security men with earpieces fanned out, their presence enough to ripple a sense of importance through the onlookers. Cameras from the press pit clicked and whirred, hungry for the first glimpse of the passenger. The jet's cabin door swung open with a hydraulic hiss. A single figure stepped into the doorway. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. She was framed by the warm golden light spilling from the cabin, her silhouette instantly commanding. A cascade of chestnut hair spilled over her shoulders in glossy waves. Her dress, an off-shoulder silk gown in midnight blue, clung gently over the curve of her very pregnant belly before flowing into a slit that revealed toned legs and diamond-studded heels. A glint of platinum and sapphire shimmered at her throat, the kind of necklace you only saw locked behind bulletproof glass. And then the murmurs became gasps. "It's her," someone whispered near the press line. Nathaniel's jaw locked. Sabrina's smirk faltered. Claire. It had been 11 months since Nathaniel had last seen her. 11 months since she had walked out of their penthouse without a word, leaving behind nothing but her wedding ring on the marble counter. He had imagined her somewhere small, hiding in shame, worn down by pregnancy and heartbreak. But the woman descending the jet stairs tonight was not the one he'd discarded. This Claire moved like she owned the air around her. She held the railing with one manicured hand, the other resting protectively over her bump. Her gaze swept over the crowd, unhurried, unafraid, like she was weighing each face and finding them irrelevant. At the bottom of the stairs, a man was waiting. Tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of presence that made even security guards straighten. He wore a black suit that fit like it had been poured over him, a watch worth more than most houses, and a face that was instantly recognizable to anyone who had ever picked up a business magazine. Elias Drake, Billionaire, CEO of Drake Global Holdings. A man whose name could send stock markets trembling. And he was here, waiting for Claire. The cameras went into overdrive as Elias stepped forward, offering his arm with a warmth and deference that made the crowd's collective jaw drop. Claire slid her hand into the crook of his elbow, as if it had always belonged there. Sabrina leaned in toward Nathaniel, her voice a sharp whisper. "What the hell is she doing here? And with him?" Nathaniel didn't answer. His mind was reeling, 1,000 questions colliding in his head. Why was Claire with Elias Drake? Why was Elias looking at her like she was the only person in the world? The master of ceremonies, visibly flustered, hurried to greet the pair. "Mr. Drake, Miss Lawson, welcome." The name caught in the air like static. She wasn't using Nathaniel's last name. She wasn't Mrs. Cross anymore. As the flashes from the cameras lit up the night like lightning, Elias bent his head toward Claire, murmuring something that made her lips curve into a small, private smile. Then, in full view of the stunned crowd, he pressed a kiss to her hand. The sound of shutters clicking was deafening. Nathaniel's throat felt dry. His fingers tightened involuntarily on Sabrina's hip, earning him a sharp look. He barely noticed. All he could see was Claire, radiant and unbothered, standing beside a man who could buy and sell his entire company before breakfast. And then Claire's eyes met his. It was only for a moment, but it was enough to hollow him out. There was no anger in her gaze, no sadness, no plea for recognition, just cool detachment, the kind that told him she didn't see him as an equal anymore. If Nathaniel had been smart, he would have looked away. Instead, he held her stare until she turned, slowly, deliberately, back to Elias, dismissing him without a word. Around them, the whispers had shifted tone. The name Claire Lawson was passing from mouth to mouth, accompanied by words like Drake's partner, power couple, and game changer. The gala's original main event, the unveiling of Nathaniel and Sabrina as a philanthropic power duo, was evaporating like mist under the heat of the spotlight now fixed on the new arrivals. As Elias led Claire toward the main entrance, Nathaniel felt the world tilt. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't the center of attention. And deep in his gut, he knew. Whatever story Claire was about to tell the world, he wasn't going to like his part in it. The jet engines behind them began to power down, but for Nathaniel, the noise in his head was just beginning to roar. Long before the cameras flashed and the jet stairs gleamed under floodlights, Claire Lawson was just a small-town girl who believed love was enough. She grew up in Maplewood, a sleepy town where everybody knew your business before you did. Her father, Dean Lawson, owned a modest auto repair shop. Her mother, Rose, ran a bakery that smelled of cinnamon every morning. They weren't wealthy, but they were honest, and they raised Claire to believe hard work and kindness could open any door. Claire had been a straight-A student, the kind who stayed late to tutor others for free. Her beauty was understated. Warm brown eyes, an easy smile, and the kind of natural grace that made people feel comfortable. She wasn't the girl everyone chased in high school, but she was the one they remembered years later. She left Maplewood at 18 on a full academic scholarship to the University of New York. Her dream was to work in nonprofit law, helping underrepresented communities. She waitressed at night, studied during the day, and sent part of her earnings back home to help her parents keep the bakery running when her father's health began to fail. It was during her junior year that she met Nathaniel Cross. Nathaniel had been a guest speaker in one of her business law classes, a young, confident entrepreneur already making waves with his first tech startup. Claire wasn't impressed at first. Sure, he was handsome in that tailored suit, Wall Street kind of way, but she had no interest in men who measured their worth in dollar signs. Nathaniel, however, noticed her. After the lecture, he struck up a conversation, curious why she hadn't been one of the many students trying to impress him. She told him bluntly, "Money's nice, but it doesn't mean you're smart or kind." He laughed, genuinely amused, and asked her to have coffee. Against her better judgment, she said yes. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into weekend trips. Nathaniel was charming, attentive, and surprisingly vulnerable with her. He spoke of wanting to build something lasting, of having grown up in a cramped apartment with a single mother. He admired her dedication to law school and her refusal to be impressed by wealth. By the time she graduated, they were inseparable. Nathaniel proposed in the gardens of the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, slipping a simple diamond ring onto her finger. Claire didn't care that it wasn't huge. She cared that the man on one knee looked at her like she was his future. Their early years were sweet, but lean. Nathaniel's business was still finding its footing, and Claire worked at a small legal aid office, often taking cases that paid little but mattered deeply. They lived in a modest apartment, cooked dinner together most nights, and dreamed of one day having children. Then Nathaniel's luck shifted. A major investment came through, and suddenly, the company exploded. Overnight, they went from budgeting for groceries to buying a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling views of the Hudson. The man who once laughed about fancy suits now owned 10. Claire, happy for him, adjusted as best she could to the world of galas, board meetings, and lavish vacations. At first, Nathaniel still seemed like the same man, bringing her coffee in bed, asking her opinion on big decisions, making her laugh until her cheeks hurt. But the more successful he became, the more that version of him seemed to fade. He started to see her less as a partner and more as an accessory. She'd catch him rolling his eyes when she talked about her pro bono cases. "You're too smart to waste your time on people who can't even pay you," he'd say, half joking, half serious. The subtle jabs grew sharper. Her clothes weren't polished enough for the events they attended. She needed to fit the part if she was going to stand beside him in public. He began spending more nights out networking, coming home late with the faint scent of perfume that wasn't hers. Claire told herself it was stress, that every marriage went through rough patches. When she discovered she was pregnant, she thought it would pull them closer again. Nathaniel seemed happy at first, holding her tighter in bed, talking about names, promising they'd make room in their busy lives for family. But the cracks didn't heal. One night, 6 months into her pregnancy, she found out the truth in the worst possible way. She had been invited to a charity gala by a friend from law school. When she arrived, she saw Nathaniel across the room, his hand on the small of a stunning blonde's back, introducing her to investors as someone very special. The humiliation was sharp and public. Their eyes met across the crowd, and instead of guilt, Nathaniel looked annoyed, as though she had ruined his evening simply by being there. They fought that night, words ricocheting off the marble walls of their penthouse. Nathaniel didn't deny the affair. In fact, he justified it. "You've changed, Claire. All you talk about is the baby in your cases. I need someone who's part of my world." Her world shattered in that moment, not because of the betrayal, but because she realized she had been living in a marriage where her worth was measured by how well she fit into his image. The next morning, she packed a bag. No screaming, no ultimatums. She left her wedding ring on the kitchen counter beside his untouched coffee and walked out. Most people assumed she went back to Maplewood, hiding from the scandal. And for a while, she let them believe it. In reality, she went somewhere no one expected, Milan. A friend from university, now a successful fashion entrepreneur, offered her a place to stay. She insisted Claire take time for herself, and for the first time in years, Claire began to breathe without Nathaniel's shadow over her. She kept her pregnancy private, refusing to let gossip dictate her life. She took consulting work in international nonprofit law, projects she could manage remotely while focusing on her health. She attended prenatal yoga classes, walked along cobblestone streets, and slowly began to feel the pieces of herself knitting back together. It was during one of these consulting projects, a global clean water initiative, that she met Elias Drake. He wasn't like Nathaniel. Elias was older, self-assured, with the quiet confidence of a man who didn't need to prove himself. He listened when she spoke, asked thoughtful questions, and treated her pregnancy not as a limitation, but as part of her life story. What began as professional collaboration evolved into long conversations over dinner, then friendship, and eventually something neither had planned. Elias never pushed. He gave her space, but when he looked at her, there was a respect in his gaze that reminded her of who she had been before Nathaniel's world swallowed her whole. By the time her second trimester ended, Claire knew she was no longer the woman Nathaniel had discarded. She was stronger, sharper, and she wasn't coming back to him. Not in this lifetime. What she didn't know yet was that fate was about to give her a stage big enough to prove it. And Nathaniel? He'd be right there in the front row. The Future Vision Gala had been circled on Nathaniel Cross's calendar for months. It wasn't just another charity function. It was the crown jewel of the city's social season, the place where deals were whispered over champagne flutes and fortunes changed hands with a handshake. For Nathaniel, it was also the perfect stage to unveil his new image. The devoted fiancée to Sabrina Vale, the rising star in high-end real estate who had a knack for charming billionaires twice her age. The rooftop reception space of the Royal Horizon Hotel and Resort was nothing short of breathtaking. Glass walls framed the skyline like a living painting. Crystal chandeliers hung from an open-beam ceiling, catching the reflection of the infinity pool just beyond the terrace. Tables draped in ivory linen sparkled with cut crystal centerpieces. Guests glided across the marble floors in gowns worth small fortunes, their laughter mingling with the strains of a live string quartet. Nathaniel thrived in this environment. He moved through the room like a conductor leading an orchestra, greeting power players with a confident smile, making introductions that left people hungry for his approval. Sabrina stayed close, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, her silver gown a deliberate choice to reflect every flicker of light in the room. She laughed at the right jokes, touched his arm at the right moments, and tossed practiced glances toward the press photographers stationed discreetly near the bar. "Remember, tonight's about the Henderson deal," Nathaniel murmured as they paused near a cluster of investors. "We seal that, and Cross Dynamics jumps into the top 5 defense tech firms in the country. And about making sure people know we're together," Sabrina added, her red lips curving. "Publicity is everything." Nathaniel's gaze slid over her approvingly. She understood the game. She'd been in the shadows long enough, first as the friend, then the business contact. Tonight, there would be no shadows, only flashbulbs. At 8:30 sharp, the master of ceremonies took the stage. The chatter quieted as Nathaniel was invited up to give the opening remarks. Cameras tracked him as he spoke about innovation, vision, and the incredible partnerships shaping the future. He thanked the gala sponsors, made a subtle nod to Sabrina in the crowd, and wrapped it all with a polished smile that had taken years to perfect. When he stepped down, the applause was polite but not electric. He didn't notice yet that people's attention was already shifting toward the far side of the terrace, where a clear view of the private tarmac could be seen through the glass. Sabrina did, though. She followed the line of sight and frowned. "Is someone else arriving? I thought the guest list was locked." Nathaniel didn't look immediately. He was too busy soaking in the nods of approval from his peers. But then the murmur started, low at first, like the hum before a storm. Heads turned. Voices whispered. Cameras began to swivel away from him. "What the hell?" Nathaniel muttered, following the gaze of half the room toward the runway. The black silhouette of a Gulfstream G700 was rolling to a stop, its matte surface gleaming under the runway lights. The resort's private security moved quickly, setting up a cordon along the red carpet that now stretched from the base of the jet's stairs to the gala entrance. Sabrina's fingers dug slightly into Nathaniel's arm. That's Drake Global Security." Nathaniel's mouth went dry. "Elias Drake? If it's him, he doesn't show up to things like this without a reason." Guests began drifting toward the glass wall, abandoning their conversations and champagne. The hum of speculation grew louder. Nathaniel felt irritation spike in his chest. This was supposed to be his night, and now some unannounced VIP was stealing the spotlight. "Relax," he told Sabrina, trying to keep his tone casual. "Whoever it is, will charm them." But even as he said it, his gut twisted. Because there was something about the energy in the room, something that told him this wasn't just about another powerful man making an entrance. There was anticipation in the air, a sense of something personal. The jet door opened with a hiss. Nathaniel couldn't yet see who was inside from where he stood, but the crowd's collective gasp reached him before the image did. And then he saw her. For a split second, his mind refused to process it. The gown, the hair, the unmistakable curve of her belly. 6 months, maybe more. Claire? Nathaniel blinked, certain he was imagining things, but the cameras flashing in rapid succession told him otherwise. She was real, she was here, and she wasn't alone. At the bottom of the stairs stood Elias Drake himself, looking every bit the billionaire titan in a perfectly tailored black suit. His expression softened as Claire descended toward him, his hand extended like a man greeting someone infinitely precious. Sabrina's nails dug deeper into Nathaniel's sleeve. "Tell me this is a joke." Nathaniel didn't answer. He couldn't. His focus was locked on Claire, who was gliding down the stairs with the kind of poise she'd never had in the years he'd known her. She didn't look toward the crowd until she reached the carpet, and when she did, her eyes swept over them with the calm indifference of someone who knew she was the main event. Conversations stopped. Even the string quartet faltered before hastily picking up the melody again. Claire's gaze landed briefly on Nathaniel and Sabrina. She didn't falter. She didn't frown or smirk. She simply looked through them as though they were just two more strangers in an overdressed crowd. Nathaniel felt the burn of humiliation creep up his neck. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She was supposed to be miles away, irrelevant, maybe even quietly regretting walking out on him. Not stepping off a private jet with one of the most powerful men in the world. The master of ceremonies, clearly scrambling, stepped forward to greet the pair. "Mr. Drake, Miss Lawson, welcome." The name hit Nathaniel like a slap. She wasn't using his last name anymore. Sabrina hissed under her breath. "Lawson? She dropped your name?" Nathaniel's mind churned. Why was Claire with Elias Drake? What was she doing here? And why did she look like she belonged on his arm? The press had swiveled entirely now, their cameras snapping like gunfire as Elias leaned in to murmur something to Claire. Whatever he said made her smile, a small, knowing curve of the lips that made Nathaniel's stomach twist. He barely noticed the Henderson investors approaching. Their earlier interest, now gone. They wanted to know the same thing as everyone else. What was the connection between Elias Drake and the pregnant woman who had just stolen the room? As Claire and Elias moved toward the entrance, the crowd parted for them like royalty. Nathaniel stood frozen, Sabrina's grip still tight on his arm, watching the woman he had once dismissed walk past him without a flicker of acknowledgement. The rest of the gala still lay ahead, but for Nathaniel, the night was already over. The night she walked out of the penthouse, the city was drowning in winter rain. It wasn't the romantic kind, the soft drizzle that made streetlights glow. This was the bitter, icy kind that seeped into your bones, turning every gust of wind into a slap. Claire didn't even have an umbrella. She had left too quickly for that. Her hair clung to her cheeks, the hem of her coat already soaked, but she didn't stop. Not when her body was trembling from more than the cold. Not when her mind was replaying the scene from just an hour ago, like a cruel loop she couldn't turn off. Nathaniel's voice, smooth and controlled as always, but laced with an edge she'd never heard before. "You've changed, Claire. All you talk about is the baby and your cases. I need someone who's part of my world." Part of his world. The words were acid in her chest. His world now meant private jets and glittering events, influencers with practiced laughs, and a future built on press coverage rather than trust. She thought she was part of it once, but the truth had been right in front of her for months. She just hadn't wanted to see it. She had found out about Sabrina in pieces. The lingering perfume on his shirts, the late nights explained away as networking, the slip of his assistant's tongue when she mentioned a reservation for two at a restaurant Claire had never been to. But it wasn't until the gala that evening, when she'd arrived unannounced, that the puzzle had come together in a single public humiliation. Nathaniel hadn't even flinched when their eyes met. He just rested his hand on Sabrina's hip, introducing her to investors with that same proud smile he used to reserve for Claire. She had made it through the rest of the night on autopilot, plastering on a polite expression, pretending the whispers around her didn't exist. But the moment the elevator doors of their building closed behind her, the dam had broken. By the time she reached the penthouse, she was shaking so badly she could barely fit the key into the lock. Nathaniel arrived not long after, his tuxedo jacket draped over one shoulder like he'd just returned from a night with friends. They fought, not with shouting. Nathaniel didn't raise his voice, but with the kind of cold precision that could cut deeper than rage. Every sentence was a blade. "I can't keep pretending this is working. You're exhausting to be around. This marriage isn't giving me what I need anymore." Claire had stood in the middle of their marble kitchen, her hand instinctively resting on her belly, and realized something devastating. He wasn't trying to hurt her in that moment. He truly believed what he was saying was reasonable. She didn't cry then. She didn't give him the satisfaction. She simply took off her wedding ring, set it beside his untouched glass of scotch, and walked into the bedroom to pack a bag. Now, out in the rain, she had no destination in mind. Maplewood was too far, too complicated, and she refused to show up on her parents' doorstep looking like the broken version of herself Nathaniel had created. She ended up at a small, nondescript hotel near the East River. The lobby was warm, the clerk polite enough not to comment on her soaked clothes or the absence of luggage. In the quiet of the room, she finally sat down, the adrenaline draining from her body all at once. Her hands shook as she peeled off her coat, revealing the curve of her belly beneath her sweater. She was 6 months pregnant, alone, and the man who was supposed to be her partner had just chosen another woman over both of them. The tears came then, silent at first, then wrenching. She curled up on the bed, holding her stomach as if to shield the child from the storm outside and the one raging in her heart. She whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "I'm here. I won't let you down. We'll be okay." Sleep didn't come. Her mind kept circling back to every moment she'd ignored the signs. The nights Nathaniel brushed off her touch, the way he'd begun introducing her at events without mentioning her accomplishments, as if her only identity was being his wife, the way he'd subtly mocked her work in nonprofit law, saying it was cute but wouldn't change the world. By morning, she looked in the mirror and barely recognized herself. Her eyes were swollen, her skin pale, her hair a tangled mess. The strong, hopeful woman who had once walked into a university lecture hall and told Nathaniel Cross that money didn't impress her. That woman felt like a ghost. For 2 weeks, she lived in that hotel room, avoiding calls from mutual friends and ignoring the buzz of her phone when Nathaniel's name appeared on the screen. She told herself she needed time to think, but really she was afraid to move at all. Afraid that if she stepped outside, she'd have to face the reality that she had no plan, no home, and no safety net. It was on the 15th day, as she sat at the small desk eating a cold bagel, that an email changed everything. It was from an old friend from law school, Sophia Romano, who now worked for an international NGO based in Milan. The subject line was simple: a lifeline, if you want it. Sophia had heard whispers about Claire's marriage ending, though she didn't press for details. What she did offer was a chance to work on a new legal initiative for water rights in developing countries. It would be remote for the first few months, then based in Milan. "I know it's sudden," Sophia wrote, "but maybe sudden is what you need." Claire stared at the email for a long time. Milan felt like another planet. But the idea of starting over somewhere Nathaniel couldn't touch her, where she could be just Claire Lawson again, lodged itself in her mind and refused to leave. That night, she booked a one-way ticket. She didn't tell Nathaniel. She didn't tell anyone. The next week, she boarded a plane with one suitcase, her laptop, and the quiet determination that she would never again let herself be defined by someone else's ambition. Still, the flight was heavy with uncertainty. She sat by the window, one hand over her belly, wondering how she would raise a child in a country where she knew almost no one, wondering if she was being reckless, wondering if she was strong enough to rebuild from the ground up. But when the plane broke through the clouds and the sun spilled across the wing, she decided something. Even if she was terrified, she would move forward. She owed that to herself. And to the baby. She didn't know it yet, but the decision to leave that rain-soaked city would set her on a path straight into the life she was meant to have, and toward the man who would stand beside her when she faced Nathaniel again. When Claire first landed in Milan, she told herself she was starting from zero. No penthouse, no luxury cars, no husband with connections that opened doors. Just a suitcase, her laptop, and a future as blank as the whitewashed apartment Sophia had arranged for her. At first, it was disorienting. The city was alive in a way that made New York feel rigid. Scooters zipped between narrow streets, church bells cut through the hum of traffic. Evenings were slow and warm, filled with people sipping espresso at tiny tables as if time itself had been trained to wait. Claire kept her head down, working for the NGO, drafting contracts for clean water projects, advising on land disputes, and managing calls across time zones. She wore simple dresses, shopped at the corner market, and blended into the rhythm of a place where no one knew she'd been the discarded wife of an American tech mogul. But fate, as she would learn, had no intention of letting her stay invisible. 3 months into her new life, Sophia invited her to a private dinner hosted by one of their project's largest donors. "He's intense," Sophia warned with a smile, "but he's on our side." The dinner was in a restored villa just outside the city, all carved stone archways and gardens that seemed too perfect to be real. Claire arrived late, traffic, a missed turn, and walked into the candlelit courtyard just as the host was speaking. That was the first time she saw Elias Drake in person. She'd heard the name, of course. Everyone in the NGO world had. Drake Global Holdings was a sprawling empire, shipping, tech, energy, infrastructure, that funded everything from renewable power plants to hospital networks. But the man himself? He was something else entirely. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made people instinctively stand a little straighter, Elias had a way of looking at someone like he was reading the story behind their eyes. His dark suit was understated, his tie loose, as if he had no need to prove he belonged anywhere. When Sophia introduced them, Elias's handshake was firm but not showy. "Claire Lawson," he said slowly, as if tasting the name. "You're the one who fixed the Uganda water rights dispute in a week." Claire felt her cheeks warm. That was a team effort. He smiled, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "A team that wouldn't have succeeded without you." Over dinner, he asked questions, not the polite kind meant to fill silence, but the kind that required real thought. How did she get into law? What had driven her to work for causes that didn't pay much, but demanded everything? She answered carefully, steering around the minefield of her marriage. But Elias noticed the gaps. By the time dessert arrived, they had moved away from policy talk. He told her about growing up the son of a dock worker, watching his father break his back for men who barely knew his name. How that had fueled his obsession with building something no one could take from him. "I know what it's like," Claire admitted quietly, "to have everything hinge on someone else's approval, and to decide you'll never live like that again." Elias didn't press for details, but his gaze told her he understood more than she was saying. After that night, their paths kept crossing, at project meetings, site visits, and later, casual dinners. Elias was never pushy, never tried to impress her with his wealth, though it was impossible to ignore. He listened. He remembered small details. He asked about her baby's health as if it genuinely mattered to him. It was during a strategy meeting for a new hospital initiative in Nairobi that the truth began to surface. They'd been discussing legal frameworks when a board member casually mentioned an American tech company trying to muscle in on the project. "Cross dynamics," the man said. "CEO's a shark. Nathaniel Cross, you know him?" The room seemed to shrink. Claire kept her face neutral. "We've met." Elias glanced at her, and in that glance, she knew he'd connected the dots. After the meeting, he found her in the hallway. "You don't have to explain," he said, "but if that man ever tries to undermine you again, I'll make sure he regrets it." Claire shook her head. "I don't need rescuing." Elias's mouth curved slightly. "I didn't say you did. I'm saying I'd stand beside you." And he did. Over the next few months, Claire's role in the NGO expanded. Elias began inviting her to high-level discussions, not because of her past, but because of her insight. She navigated complex negotiations with quiet authority, and more than once, Elias deferred to her judgment in front of people who weren't used to taking orders from anyone but him. Somewhere along the line, respect became friendship. Friendship blurred into something warmer. Late-night calls, shared meals, moments of laughter that made the air feel lighter. Elias never treated her pregnancy as an inconvenience. If anything, he was protective without being overbearing. By the time Claire entered her third trimester, Elias made her an offer that stunned her: a position as chief legal advisor for the global humanitarian division of Drake Holdings. It came with resources she could only dream of, and the freedom to choose her own projects. She accepted. Not because of the title or the money, but because it felt like a step into the life she'd always wanted. A life where her work mattered, where she had agency, and where no one could diminish her worth. Then came the gala invitation. The Future Vision Gala was co-hosted by several corporate giants, including Drake Holdings. Claire hadn't planned to attend. Her due date was approaching, and long evenings in heels weren't exactly doctor-recommended. But when she saw the list of attendees, one name stood out like a spark on dry grass: Nathaniel Cross. She could have avoided it, could have stayed in Milan, sent regrets, and spared herself the inevitable whispers. But something in her shifted as she stared at that name. She didn't want revenge, not exactly. She wanted truth. Proof, for herself more than anyone, that she wasn't the woman who had walked away from a marble kitchen with rain in her hair and no plan. So she said yes. Elias didn't question her choice. He simply arranged for the Drake Global jet, had his security coordinate with the resort, and told her, "If you're walking into a room where he is, you're not walking in alone." When the night came, Claire dressed slowly, deliberately. The midnight blue gown draped perfectly over her bump, the sapphire necklace catching the light like frozen fire. Her hair was swept into soft waves, her makeup subtle but precise. On the jet, Elias sat across from her, reviewing notes for his speech. At one point, he looked up and said, "You know, the moment you step off that plane, he'll realize you were never his to define." Claire met his gaze steady. "Good, that's the point." By the time the Gulfstream touched down on the private tarmac, she felt no fear, only clarity. She wasn't there to make a scene or to provoke him. She was there to live her life, in full view, without apology. Nathaniel would be at the bottom of that metaphorical list, just another person watching her walk past. And if the sight of her on Elias Drake's arm shook the foundations of his carefully constructed world, well, that was just gravity doing its job. Transformation didn't happen for Claire overnight. It wasn't as simple as buying a new wardrobe or walking with a straighter back. It began in small, almost invisible ways, choices that looked insignificant from the outside but rebuilt her piece by piece. The first change was her mornings. In New York, she had woken to the sound of Nathaniel's phone buzzing with early conference calls, her own day dictated by his schedule. In Milan, she set her alarm for sunrise, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She would sit on the narrow balcony of her apartment, sipping chamomile tea, watching the city slowly come alive. For the first time in years, she wasn't rushing. She wasn't trying to keep up with someone else's pace. She started walking everywhere. The cobblestone streets and uneven staircases of the city weren't kind to heels, so she wore soft leather flats, weaving through morning markets and quiet piazzas. Strangers smiled at her, not because of her last name or the man she was with, but because she was simply another person in the world. Her work flourished in that quiet. With the resources Elias had given her in her new role, she built a small but fierce legal team that specialized in untangling some of the world's most complicated humanitarian contracts. She negotiated with ministries, faced down corporate lawyers twice her age, and won cases that directly changed thousands of lives. Each victory was another thread in the fabric of her confidence. Physically, she changed too, not in the way magazines sell makeovers, but in a deeper sense. Pregnancy had reshaped her body, but instead of hiding it, she began to embrace it. She chose clothing that celebrated her form, silk gowns, tailored coats, wrap dresses that moved with her rather than constricting her. She cut her hair into long, layered waves that framed her face, softening the angles she'd grown too critical of. One afternoon, Elias stopped by her office unexpectedly. She was leaning over a conference table, explaining a complex clause to her team. When she looked up, he was standing in the doorway, studying her with a faint smile. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "Just, you look like you own the room." She didn't tell him, but that was the first time in years she truly believed she did. Her social life shifted as well. The people around her weren't there because of Nathaniel's business cards. They were friends, colleagues, allies. She spent evenings at small dinner parties where conversations ranged from art to politics to whose pasta recipe was superior. She laughed more. The kind of laughter that left her cheeks aching, the kind she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Still, there were nights when old memories crept in. She would think of the girl who had walked out into the rain that night, suitcase in hand, wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. On those nights, she would place her hands over her belly, feeling the flutter of life inside, and remind herself, "You left to save both of you." As her due date drew closer, Elias became a more constant presence. Not in the way Nathaniel had been, hovering, possessive, but in a quiet, steady way. He accompanied her to doctor's appointments when Sophia couldn't. He made sure she had what she needed without making it feel like charity. And when she expressed concern about balancing work and motherhood, he listened without offering empty reassurances. "You'll figure it out," he said simply. "You've figured out everything else." In late spring, a package arrived at her apartment. Inside was a gown, midnight blue, cut to flow over her pregnancy with elegance. and a matching sapphire necklace. There was no note, just a small card with the logo of a luxury Milanese designer. She didn't need one to know who it was from. When she called Elias to thank him, he brushed it off. "I saw it in the window and thought it would look good on you. No agenda." But she suspected he knew exactly what he was doing. He was giving her the armor she would one day wear into battle. That battle came sooner than she expected. A week later, the gala invitation arrived. Her first instinct was to decline. She didn't want to wade into Nathaniel's world again, to risk the whispers and sidelong glances. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she didn't have to see it that way. This wasn't his world anymore. It was simply a room she had every right to walk into. Preparation for the night became a ritual. She booked a stylist, something she'd never done before, not even during her marriage. She wanted precision, hair, makeup, gown, all of it a reflection of the woman she had become. On the day of the gala, she woke before dawn. The stylist arrived mid-morning, filling her apartment with the scent of hairspray and the rhythmic click of makeup brushes against glass jars. By late afternoon, the gown hung perfectly on her frame, the necklace resting against her collarbone like it had been made for her alone. When Elias arrived to escort her to the jet, his expression told her everything she needed to know. "You're ready," he said simply. The flight to the resort was smooth, the hum of the engines almost meditative. Claire sat by the window, the city lights falling away beneath them, and thought about the road she had taken to get here. Every doubt, every sleepless night, every moment she'd had to choose herself over the fear of starting again. This was more than an entrance. It was a declaration. As they approached the runway, Elias leaned toward her. "When you step out there, you don't owe anyone a single word of explanation." She smiled faintly. "I know." The jet touched down with a whisper of tires against tarmac. Claire felt the shift in the air even before the engines powered down. Somewhere beyond those cabin doors was a crowd expecting someone else to be the story of the night. But tonight, the story was hers. The stairs lowered. Claire stood, smoothing the silk over her belly, the sapphire necklace cool against her skin. She glanced at Elias, who offered his arm, not as a claim, but as an ally. And when the door opened to the flood of runway lights, she stepped forward without hesitation. The air outside the jet was warmer than Claire expected, carrying the faint scent of salt from the nearby harbor. Floodlights framed the scarlet runner like a stage, and for one charged heartbeat, she stood still at the top of the stairs, feeling the weight of every eye below. Elias moved first, descending the steps with an unhurried grace that signaled absolute authority. Cameras clicked like a drum roll. Then he turned back, extending his arm toward her. She placed her hand in his and began her descent. It was astonishing how quiet the crowd became. Moments ago, the terrace had been buzzing with champagne chatter and deal-making laughter. Now, the only sounds were the shudder bursts of photographers and the low hum of the engines winding down. Even the string quartet inside had paused mid-measure. Her sapphire necklace caught the lights, sending small flashes into the faces staring up at her. The silk of her midnight blue gown flowed over the curve of her belly, a bold declaration rather than something to hide. She felt no urge to rush. Every step was deliberate. At the bottom, Elias's security parted the crowd with efficient precision, guiding them toward the main entrance. That's when she saw him, Nathaniel, standing frozen near the glass doors. Sabrina latched onto his arm like a vice. His face was unreadable for exactly 1 second. Then she saw it. The flicker of disbelief, followed by the tightness of a man fighting to keep control. Sabrina wasn't as disciplined. Her mouth actually fell open before she masked it with a brittle smile. Her silver gown suddenly looked like a poor imitation of something Claire had once worn to one of Nathaniel's product launches. Claire's gaze slid over them without pause, but Elias, perceptive as always, slowed just enough to make the moment unavoidable. "Mr. Cross," Elias said evenly as they drew level, his deep voice carrying in the stunned quiet. "Didn't expect to see you here." Nathaniel's jaw flexed. "Mr. Drake, likewise." His eyes flicked to Claire. "Claire," she met his gaze, cool and steady. "Nathaniel?" Just the name. No venom, no warmth. The absence of emotion was its own kind of power. Sabrina, perhaps sensing the imbalance, jumped in. "We were just telling people how surprised we are to see you, especially like this. Her eyes dropped pointedly to Claire's stomach. It was a cheap move, designed to remind the room of the timeline, to reduce her to gossip fodder. But before Claire could respond, Elias's voice cut through. Like this? He tilted his head slightly, as if inviting her to explain. Sabrina's smile faltered. I just meant pregnant and all. Claire spoke then, her tone calm enough to make the words land harder. Pregnant and successful, pregnant and working on projects that will outlast all of us, pregnant and walking into a room where I belong. A murmur rippled through the crowd, subtle but unmistakable. Nathaniel shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing. Still the dramatic one, I see. Claire didn't rise to it. Still the one who mistakes truth for drama, I see. For a beat, the air between them tightened, full of things neither would say here. Then Elias placed a gentle hand at her back, guiding her toward the open doors. But before they stepped inside, Claire turned back, not to Nathaniel, but to the crowd that had been pretending not to watch. Excuse us, she said lightly. We have a gala to attend. It was subtle, but the message was clear. The conversation was over, and she was the one ending it. Inside, the shift in attention was immediate. Guests gravitated toward Elias and Claire, eager for introductions. The MC nearly tripped over himself, adjusting the evening's order to accommodate their arrival. Photographers followed discreetly, capturing moments that would be splashed across business and society pages by morning. Claire felt the rhythm of the night fall into place around her. Not the frantic, performative energy of Nathaniel's world, but a current she could navigate with ease. When people asked about her work, she spoke about the Clean Water Initiative, about partnerships in Africa and Asia, about the importance of sustainable policy. Elias stood beside her, adding details when needed, but never overshadowing her. At one point, she caught Nathaniel watching from across the room. Sabrina was saying something to him, her expression tight, but his eyes were fixed on Claire. She didn't look away. She let him see her like this, confident, unshaken, untethered from him entirely. An hour later, as the gala transitioned into its charity auction, Elias leaned close and murmured, "That went better than expected." She smiled faintly. "I wasn't here for him." "I know." His gaze softened, but he needed to see it. When the auction ended, Claire and Elias made their way to the terrace. The night air was cooler now, the runway lights in the distance casting long shadows. She stood at the railing for a moment, looking out, not at the jet that had brought her here, but at the city beyond. This wasn't about proving Nathaniel wrong anymore. It was about proving herself right, that leaving had been the first step toward something greater. Inside, music swelled again, the crowd resuming its flow. Claire turned from the view, ready to rejoin the world that had once felt closed to her. And somewhere across the room, Nathaniel Cross finally understood. She hadn't come back to his orbit. She'd built her own, and it was far brighter than his. The gala ended in a swirl of applause and crystal clinking, but Claire and Elias slipped out before the crowd began to thin. The air outside was cooler now, the night sky deep and clear above the tarmac. The Gulf Stream waited, its lights glowing like beacons in the dark. Claire took a long breath. The adrenaline from the evening was still humming through her veins, but it wasn't the sharp, jittery kind she used to feel after events with Nathaniel. This was steady, grounded. Elias noticed. "You handled that perfectly," he said, walking beside her. "I didn't go there to handle him," she replied. "I went there to show up for me." They reached the bottom of the jet's stairs before Elias spoke again. "Still," he said, "you did more than that. You made sure every single person in that room saw you for who you are now." She smiled, a small, private curve of her lips. Then it was worth the trip. As the engines started their slow build, she glanced back once toward the glittering rooftop terrace in the distance. Somewhere up there, Nathaniel was probably replaying every second of her arrival, searching for cracks in the armor that didn't exist. She didn't wish him well, but she didn't wish him harm either. She simply didn't wish him anything. And that, she realized, was the truest form of freedom. The flight back to Milan was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when two people don't need to fill space with words. Claire watched the city lights fall away beneath them, her hand resting on her belly. Every so often, she felt the small, reassuring movements of the life inside her, and it reminded her exactly why she'd fought so hard to reclaim herself. In the days that followed, news of the gala spread faster than she could have imagined. Photos of her stepping off the jet with Elias were everywhere. Business blogs, society columns, even international news outlets. The captions varied. Humanitarian lawyer stuns at future vision gala. Claire Lawson, from small-town girl to global game-changer. And of course, the more sensational headlines that loved the angle of the pregnant ex-wife. She ignored the gossip. She answered only the calls that mattered. Partners from her NGO work, old friends who reached out with genuine pride, journalists who wanted to talk about the Clean Water Initiative instead of her personal life. Nathaniel never called. She wasn't sure if that was because he knew it would be useless or because Sabrina had made it clear she didn't want her name mentioned in the same breath as Claire's again. Either way, it didn't matter. 2 weeks later, she stood in her Milan office, reviewing a proposal for a renewable energy project in rural India, when Elias stepped in. "Lunch?" he asked casually. She glanced up. "You have time for lunch?" "For you, yes." Over pasta and fresh bread at a small trattoria, he leaned back and studied her. "You know, there's something about you now that wasn't there when we met." Claire raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "You've stopped bracing for impact." The words hit her in a way she didn't expect. Because he was right. When she'd first arrived in Milan, she'd lived like someone expecting the floor to give out at any second. Now she trusted the ground beneath her feet. "That's because I'm not living in someone else's story anymore," she said softly. Elias smiled. "Good. Keep it that way." By the time summer rolled in, Claire's life had settled into a rhythm she could finally call her own. She worked on projects she believed in, surrounded herself with people who valued her, and prepared for motherhood, not as a burden, but as an extension of her strength. The baby arrived in early August, a daughter with her mother's eyes and a surprisingly fierce cry for someone so small. Holding her for the first time, Claire felt an overwhelming surge of both love and determination. This child would never have to wonder what it looked like when a woman chose herself. In the quiet of the hospital room, Elias visited. He didn't bring flowers or balloons, just a small, carved wooden rattle from Ghana, where one of their projects had recently wrapped. "For her," he said simply, placing it in Claire's hand. She looked at him, gratitude heavy in her chest. "Thank you for everything." "I didn't do this," he replied. "You did." Months passed. The world moved on from the story of the gala, as it always does. But for Claire, the impact lingered, not because of the press, but because of what it represented. She'd walked back into a space designed to intimidate her, and she'd left on her own terms. Every now and then, she heard whispers of Nathaniel's struggles. A failed merger, tension with investors, public spats with Sabrina. She never commented, never indulged in the satisfaction of knowing his empire wasn't as untouchable as he'd once believed. Her focus was forward. One evening, as she rocked her daughter to sleep, she thought about the girl she used to be, the one who thought love was enough to protect her from betrayal. That girl had walked into the rain with nothing but a suitcase. The woman she had become? She'd walked off a jet with the world watching, not to prove anything to anyone else, but to remind herself that she had always been more than someone's wife. If there was one truth she wanted her daughter to grow up knowing, it was this. You don't have to burn bridges to leave them behind. Sometimes the greatest act of strength is simply walking past them without looking back. And if life ever handed her the kind of heartbreak that once brought Claire to her knees, she hoped her daughter would remember her mother's story, not as a tale of revenge, but as proof that women are capable of building new worlds from the ashes of old ones. Because Claire Lawson had learned the most valuable lesson of all. You can lose everything you thought defined you, and still find yourself standing taller than ever.